The town council meeting was held on the 5th of December, 1888. I remember the date because the frost had etched ferns across the inside of the windows, delicate and intricate, as though the cold itself were an artist mocking us with beauty while it killed. The room smelled of wet wool and pipe tobacco, and the particular sourness of men who have already made a decision but must pretend they are still deliberating. There were 14 of them seated around a long table in the Corbin Falls Town Hall, a table that James had built 3 years earlier, back when the town still considered us useful. The irony of sitting in judgment at a table my husband's hands had planed and sanded and joined was lost on every man in that room. Or perhaps it was not lost on them at all. Perhaps that was precisely the point. My husband, James Whitfield, had been in the ground for 2 months. Taken by a fever that moved faster than prayer, faster than the doctor could ride from Cheyenne, faster than my own desperate hands could cool his burning skin with wet rags through 3 sleepless nights. He was 31 years old when he died, a carpenter and a farmer, a man who spoke little but noticed everything. A man who carved our initials into the doorpost of our cabin on the day we moved in, not with any ceremony, just a quiet act of permanence that I did not fully appreciate until permanence was taken from me. I was 29 years old, and in the eyes of the 14 men who sat at my husband's table, I had become a problem to be solved. Silas Crawford cleared his throat. He was the head of the council and the owner of the town's only mercantile, a man who had built his authority not through wisdom or courage, but through the simple fact that he controlled the supply of flour and ammunition and coffee. When you are the only man in town who can sell a woman salt in January, you do not need to be wise. You only need to be present. He was a tall man, thin, in the way of people who eat well but burn everything they consume in the furnace of their own ambition. His eyes were pale and set too close together, giving him the permanent expression of someone squinting at a column of figures that did not add up. He would not look at me. He focused instead on a spot on the wall just over my head, the way a man looks at a horse he is about to put down. Clara, he began, his voice flat with practiced authority. We have reviewed your situation. The property charter is quite specific. The claim reverts to the township upon the death of the signatory unless there is a male heir of working age. I said nothing. My hands were folded in my lap, my knuckles white. I could feel the stares of the other men. Some pitied me. Most were simply impatient. They had livestock to feed and wood to chop and their own families to worry about. A widow was an inconvenience. A widow in December was worse. She was a question no one wanted to answer. And then there is the matter of your mother, Silas continued, finally letting his gaze fall on me. It was a heavy, dismissive glance, the kind you give to something you have already decided to discard. She requires care. The winter is forecast to be the worst in a decade. A lone woman is a liability, Clara. A woman with an elder is a burden. The word hung in the air. Burden. It did not land like a slap. A slap is quick and sharp and over in a moment. This was a slow, crushing weight, the kind that settles on your chest and presses the breath out of you by inches. I had carried my mother my entire life, not as a burden, but as the other half of my own heart. She had raised me alone, had fed me when there was not enough for both of us, had taught me every useful thing I knew. To hear Silas Crawford call her a burden in a room full of men who had eaten bread at my table and warmed themselves at my hearth was a specific kind of violence, the kind that leaves no mark on the skin but shatters something essential inside you. You have until sundown to vacate the cabin, he concluded. His duty was done. The township will provide you with a day's rations. He said this with the air of a man presenting a generous gift, and I understood in that moment something fundamental about Silas Crawford. He was not cruel. He was something far more dangerous. He was a man who had confused his own fear with reason, his own convenience with justice. He did not hate me. He simply could not afford me. And in the arithmetic of his small, calculating mind, that was the same thing. I finally met his eyes. I did not cry. I did not plead. I had buried my husband with dry eyes because I knew that tears would not bring him back, and that the energy spent weeping was energy stolen from surviving. I simply nodded, a single sharp movement of my head. In that moment, something formed in my soul. It was hard and clear as ice, and it was not despair. It was decision. They saw liability, a burden. I would show them what a burden could endure. As I stood to leave, I saw a figure in the doorway. Ruth Crawford, Silas's wife, stood half hidden in the shadow of the doorframe. She was a small, careful woman who moved through the world as though apologizing for taking up space. She said nothing, but her eyes were red, and as I passed her, she pressed something into my hand, a small bundle wrapped in cloth. I did not look at it then. I pushed it into my coat pocket and stepped outside into the killing cold. The air hit me like a wall of knives, but it was the cold inside that room that chilled me most. It was the cold of men who mistake rules for wisdom and survival for something they alone are strong enough to manage. They thought they were casting me out. They had no idea they were setting me free. I walked past the church on my way back to the cabin. Reverend George Pruitt stood on the steps, his hands clasped in front of him. His expression arranged into something that was meant to look like compassion, but more closely resembled the face of a man who has been caught doing nothing and is trying to make it look deliberate. He was a short, round man with a voice that could fill a room on Sundays but could not seem to find the strength to travel across a porch on a Tuesday afternoon. "The Lord will provide, Clara," he said. I looked at him. The Lord did not vote in that council meeting, Reverend, I thought. But I did not say it. I had no energy left for men and their useless words. I nodded and kept walking. The cabin James had built was small and sturdy, and every log held a memory. The threshold where he would sit each evening to pull off his boots. The window he had set facing east so that the morning light would fall across our bed. The shelf he had made for my mother's teapot, the only thing she had carried with her from her life, before a chipped blue pot with a lid that never sat quite right. This was not just a building, it was the physical evidence of a life we had made together, and I was about to walk away from every piece of it. My mother, Margaret Hargrove, was sitting by the cold hearth wrapped in every blanket we owned. She was 70 years old. Her bones were as delicate as a bird's, her skin thin and papery, her frame so diminished by age and illness that she seemed to be slowly disappearing into herself. But her eyes were fierce. They had always been fierce. Even now, even wrapped in blankets in a freezing cabin, waiting to hear whether she would be allowed to keep living under a roof. Those eyes burned with a sharp, defiant intelligence. She had heard the verdict in my footsteps. She could always read me better than any book. So she said. Her voice was a dry whisper, but it carried the weight of absolute certainty. They have made their choice. I nodded, going to the small chest where we kept our essentials. And I have made mine. She did not ask me what that choice was. She did not need to. She had spent 70 years reading the faces of people who held power over her, and she had spent 29 of those years reading mine. She knew before I said another word that I was not going to beg, and I was not going to break. She began folding the blanket closest to her, smoothing it with her hands in that deliberate, unhurried way of hers, the way a soldier cleans his rifle before a battle. Not because the blanket needed folding, but because preparation is its own form of courage. I watched her hands move over the fabric, and I thought about how many times those hands had saved us. When I was 7 and the influenza came through our valley and took half the children in the county, those hands had pressed cool cloths to my forehead for 9 days straight. When I was 12 and a late frost killed every seedling in our garden, and we faced a summer with nothing growing, those hands had gathered wild greens from the forest and dried them into a powder that kept us fed until the second planting took hold. When I was 19 and so sick with grief over a boy who had broken my heart that I could not eat or sleep or see the purpose in anything, those hands had pulled me out of bed and set me to work because my mother believed correctly that labor was the only reliable cure for heartbreak. Those hands had never been idle. They had never been useless. And the idea that any man in any room could look at what those hands had done and call them a burden made me want to set the council building on fire. My mother had survived things that would have broken lesser women. She had been abandoned by my father, a man named Henry Hargrove, when I was 5 years old. He left on a Tuesday morning in April, said he was going to check the fence line, and never came back. No note, no explanation, just the sound of hooves on the road growing fainter, until there was nothing left but silence, and the slow realization that silence was going to be permanent. My mother had stood in the doorway of their small house, watching the empty road for 3 hours before she turned around, picked me up and said, "Well then, it is just us now." And that was the last time she ever mentioned his name. She raised me alone. She taught me to cook and to sew and to read. She taught me which plants were edible and which would kill you. She taught me how to set a snare for rabbits and how to tell the weather by the behavior of birds. She taught me that crying was acceptable, but only in private and only for a limited time, because tears used energy, and energy was currency, and currency should not be spent on things that could not be bought. She was the toughest person I had ever known, and she weighed less than a sack of flour. The inheritance James had left me was not written on any piece of paper. It was a story he told me one night years ago, lying in bed while a storm rattled the shutters. He spoke of a place the local prospectors called Fool's Hollow, a cave system high up on Ridgeback Mountain that everyone avoided. The prospectors said it was a dead end, a place where signs of gold vanished into bare rock and the wind never stopped howling. But James had heard a different story from an old trapper who had come through town. A man named Josiah Crane. The cave breathes, Clara James had told me, his eyes lit with the mystery of it, the way they always lit when he encountered something he could not explain but desperately wanted to understand. The old man swore it holds the mountain's warmth, something about the rock, the way the air moves through it. He said it was warmer inside than any cabin. I had smiled and kissed his forehead and told him it was a fine story for a winter night. I had not taken it seriously. It was folklore, a piece of mountain mythology no more real than the tales of lost gold that drew foolish men into the wilderness every spring. But now, standing in a cabin that was no longer mine, facing a winter that every man in town said would kill us, it was all I had. A dead man's story about a breathing mountain. I packed what I could onto our small hand sled, an axe with a handle James had carved from hickory, a saw, our cast iron pot blackened by 1,000 meals, 2 sacks of flour, one nearly empty, a small bag of salt, our last tin of coffee, which I placed carefully in the center of the load because it was not just coffee, but the last taste of the life we were leaving behind. I packed our Bible not because I had much faith left in the God who had allowed this to happen, but because it had been my mother's mother's Bible, and some things you carry not for their content, but for their continuity. I gathered the blankets from my mother's lap. "We are leaving," I told her gently. She did not argue. She did not ask where. She simply held out her arms. Lifting her was like lifting a bundle of dry sticks, all sharp angles and surprising weightlessness. She could not have weighed more than 90 pounds. But the trust in that gesture, the absolute surrender of her body to my arms, gave me a strength I did not know I possessed. It was a silent pact between us. She was trusting me with her life, and that trust was heavier and more precious than any physical weight. I wrapped her in the blankets and secured her to the sled with rope. Then I took stock of the last living thing we owned. Bess, our old milk cow. She was bony and tired, her ribs showing through her winter coat, her breath blooming in the frigid air, like small ghosts escaping her body. But she was steady. She had always been steady. I tied a rope to her halter, and she followed without protest the way she had followed us through every season of our life on this land. The town watched us go. I saw faces in the windows, shadows behind curtains. I saw Martha Hensley in her doorway, her hand pressed to her mouth. I saw old Tom Wheeler standing on his porch, his hat in his hands, shaking his head slowly. No one came out. No one offered a hand or a word or a scrap of food beyond the miserable day's rations Silas Crawford had decreed. They watched as I put my shoulder to the sled, as I leaned into the rope and felt it cut into my palms through my thin gloves, as I pulled my mother and all our worldly possessions away from the only home I had ever known, with our old cow trailing faithfully behind. They watched, and they did nothing. I do not say this with bitterness, though bitterness would be justified. I say it because it is important to understand what a community becomes when it allows fear to replace compassion. Every one of those people was decent in isolation. They were kind to their children. They fed their dogs. They said grace before meals and meant it. But collectively, in the grip of a hard winter and the arithmetic of scarcity, they became something less than the sum of their parts. They became a council of 14 men who could send a widow and her mother into a killing frost and call it policy. I reached into my coat pocket as we cleared the last buildings of town and felt the small bundle Ruth Crawford had pressed into my hand. I opened it with numb fingers. Inside was a fistful of dried tea leaves and a small cake of soap, items of no great value. But Ruth had given them in secret at risk to herself, and that made them worth more than anything the town council had ever offered. I did not understand then why she had done it. I would not understand for a long time, but I tucked the bundle back into my pocket close to my body, and I carried it with me up the mountain. The ascent up Ridgeback Mountain was a battle against a living enemy. The cold was not merely a temperature. It was a predator with teeth and patience. It bit at every inch of exposed skin, turning my cheeks to raw leather and my fingers to wooden pegs that could barely grip the rope. It seared my lungs with every breath, each inhalation a small act of violence against my own body. And it sought with a relentless and intimate cruelty to leach the very warmth from our bones. The snow was deep, a fine dry powder that offered no purchase. With every step, I sank to my shins, sometimes to my knees, and the effort of pulling free was like dragging my legs through wet cement. The sled caught on buried rocks and hidden roots. Bess stumbled and lowed mournfully, her hooves slipping on the icy underlayer beneath the powder. The mountain was not just steep, it was hostile. It resisted us with every tool it had. The trees, what few remained at this altitude, were stunted and twisted into grotesque shapes by decades of wind, their bare branches reaching out like the fingers of drowned men. The rocks beneath the snow were slick with ice, angled at treacherous grades, and twice the sled tipped sideways, and I had to wrestle it upright while my mother lay strapped to it, silent, patient, trusting me with a faith I was not sure I deserved. The rope cut deeper into my hands with every yard we gained. I could feel the fibers of my gloves giving way, and then the fibers of my skin, and then there was nothing between the rope and the raw flesh beneath except stubbornness and the refusal to let go. I thought about James as I climbed. I thought about his hands, which had been large and steady, and warm hands that could shape a piece of wood into something beautiful, with nothing but a knife and patience. I thought about the last morning I saw him, healthy, standing in the doorway of our cabin, with the sunrise behind him, his silhouette dark against the golden light, and how he had turned and smiled at me and said something ordinary, something I cannot even remember now, something about the weather, or the fence, or the cow. I would give everything I own to remember what he said that morning. But the memory is gone, swallowed by the fever and the grief and the thousand urgent necessities that followed his death. All I have left is the silhouette and the smile and the knowledge that the last ordinary moment of my life happened on a morning I did not know was extraordinary. The sun was a pale, useless disk in a white sky, offering light, but no warmth, as though the universe wished us to see clearly exactly how doomed we were. It began to sink toward the horizon far too quickly, bleeding pale oranges and purples into the gray. The temperature, already murderous, plummeted with the light. I could feel it dropping in real time each minute, colder than the last, the air thickening with a malice that felt personal. My own sweat had frozen on my brow and in my hair. My eyelashes were crusted with ice. Each blink was an effort. I focused on the ground immediately in front of me, on the next step, and only the next step, because to look up at the vast white emptiness of the mountain above was to invite a despair I could not afford. My mother had not spoken for over an hour. Her stillness on the sled was terrifying. I stopped, my lungs burning, my legs trembling with exhaustion, and pushed back the blanket from her face with hands I could barely feel. Her skin was waxy translucent, the color of old candle tallow. Her lips were tinged with blue. Her breath was a shallow, barely visible mist. She was alive, but only just. The line between sleeping and dying had become terrifyingly thin. Bess stood with her head low, shivering so violently her whole body seemed to buzz. The animal knew as I did that to stop here was to die here, but she could not go on much further. None of us could. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through my exhaustion like a needle through cloth. This was it. This was the moment of failure. Silas Crawford's voice echoed in my head, as clear as if he were standing beside me in the snow. A liability, a burden, and a smaller, more treacherous voice, my own voice, whispered beneath his. Maybe he was right. Maybe this was a fool's errand, a prideful march to a frozen grave. Maybe the kindest thing, the most merciful thing would be to simply stop. To lie down in the snow beside my mother and let the cold take us both into a painless sleep. It would be so easy, so quiet. The snow would cover us, and by morning we would be nothing but two small rises in the white, and by spring, even those would be gone. I looked at my mother's face, at the faint flickering pulse in her throat, at the life still clinging to her with a stubbornness that matched my own. And something inside me broke, not my will. My will was the last thing to break, and it never did. What broke was the despair. It shattered like thin ice under a boot heel, and beneath it was something I had not expected. Rage, pure and hot and utterly unreasonable. It surged through me like a second bloodstream, warming my frozen limbs, filling my dead fingers with furious life. I would not let her die because of some man's signature on a piece of paper. I would not let this mountain be our tombstone. I would not give Silas Crawford the satisfaction of being right. I screamed into the wind. A wordless sound of pure defiance ripped from the deepest part of my throat. It was not a cry for help. It was a declaration of war. Then I bent down and untied my mother from the sled. I hoisted her into my arms, her body so light it felt like carrying an armful of dry leaves, and I began to climb. I half dragged, half carried her through the deepening drifts, my legs churning my lungs, screaming my voice hoarse as I shouted her name, shouted James's name, shouted at the uncaring sky and the indifferent mountain, and the God who had allowed 14 men to send 2 women out to die. Bess followed. Her low, mournful call was an echo of my own defiance, a sound that said, "We are still here, we are still moving, we have not stopped." And then I saw it, a shadow against the rock face, a darkness deeper than the dusk, a hole in the side of the mountain ragged and black like a wound in the stone, the entrance to Fool's Hollow. It was not grand, it was not inviting. It was a jagged mouth in the granite exhaling a faint mist that was visibly warmer than the killing air around us. The mist rose from the opening like breath, like the mountain itself was a living thing and it was breathing. We stumbled inside and collapsed in a heap just beyond the entrance. The sudden silence was deafening. The relentless shriek of the wind, which had been the soundtrack of our misery for hours, was simply gone, replaced by a profound subterranean stillness that pressed against my eardrums like cotton. The temperature was still cold, but the absence of wind made it feel almost warm by comparison. The air smelled of damp earth and something else, something ancient and mineral and strangely clean. I laid my mother down on the rocky floor. Every muscle in my body screamed. My hands were bleeding where the rope had cut through my gloves. My legs shook so badly I could not stand. We were out of the wind, but we were not safe. Not yet. We had traded a fast death for a slow one. I fumbled for my lantern in a match with fingers that felt like they belonged to someone else. The first match head snapped off. The second flared and died killed by my own trembling breath. I cupped my hands around the third, shielding it from the faint draft of the cave, and a small, steady flame bloomed in the darkness. I touched it to the lantern wick, and warm yellow light pushed back the immense blackness around us. We were in a small antechamber, the ceiling low enough to touch the walls slick with moisture. But ahead I could see a narrow passage leading deeper into the mountain. The air flowing from it was discernibly warmer, carrying that same earthy scent. I helped my mother to her feet. She leaned against me, her weight almost nothing, and we shuffled into the passage. Bess followed, her hooves clicking nervously on the stone, her great body barely fitting through the narrow gap. The passage opened into a second larger cavern, perhaps 30 feet across, with a ceiling high enough that the lantern light could not find it. And there, tucked against the far wall, shielded from any draft, was the evidence of a life lived before ours. A stack of wood cut and seasoned piled neatly to my shoulder. Dry, ancient timber, gray with age, but solid. Beside it, a collapsed circle of stones, a hearth long cold. Its chimney was a dark fissure snaking upward into the rock above, vanishing into blackness. And next to the hearth, a small collection of tools and a crude wooden crate. Inside the crate, wrapped in brittle oilcloth, was a small leather-bound journal. I opened it with trembling hands. The pages were filled with cramped, spidery handwriting. A name on the first page, Josiah Crane, and beneath it a date, 1871. I read the first entry aloud, my voice barely a whisper in the vast silence of the cavern. I came to this place because there was nowhere else to go. They said I was used up, that a man with a ruined leg is a mouth without hands. They are wrong. I will prove them wrong, or I will die here proving it. But I will not go back. I will not beg. My breath caught in my throat. I looked up from the journal, looked at the careful stack of wood, at the collapsed hearth that had once held fire, at the tools left behind by a man who had faced the same verdict I had. Cast out, called useless, left to die. And he had not died. He had built something here in the dark heart of a mountain, and he had left a map for anyone desperate enough to follow. I looked at my mother. She was watching me with weary, hopeful eyes. The firelight from the lantern played across her face, and for a moment she looked like the young woman she must have been once before life and loss had whittled her down to bone and will. The despair of the last hours vanished. In its place was something fiercer, something that burned hotter than rage and lasted longer than hope. It was purpose. We were not at the end of our journey. We were at the beginning of our work. The next days were a blur of labor unlike anything I had ever known. My body, which had spent years learning the gentle rhythms of keeping a home of kneading dough and hanging laundry and mending shirts by candlelight, was broken down and rebuilt by the cave. It was as though the mountain had taken the woman who crawled through its mouth and decided to remake her into something harder, something more suited to the stone and the silence and the work that needed to be done. The first task was the fireplace. Without fire, we were dead. It was that simple. The cold inside the cave was not the killing cold of the mountainside, but it was a deep, patient cold that would take us just as surely, only slower. It would creep into our joints and settle into our lungs, and one morning we simply would not wake up. I had seen what cold did to people. I had seen the blue lips and the rigid fingers and the peaceful expressions on faces that had stopped fighting. I would not let that happen here. Josiah Crane's journal was my guide. He wrote with a plain-spoken clarity that I came to love the voice of a man who understood systems and had no patience for decoration. The base must be wide, he wrote. Use the flat stones from the west wall. They hold heat longer than the round ones from the floor. The flue needs to be narrow at the throat to create a strong draw. If you build it too wide, you will lose your heat up the chimney. Too narrow and the smoke will fill the room and kill you before the cold gets the chance. I found the stones he described. They were along the western wall of the cavern, exactly where he said they would be. Heavy, unforgiving slabs of granite, some as large as a man's torso, others small enough to carry, but dense enough to make my arms tremble. I dragged them one by one across the cavern floor, my boots scraping against the rock, my shoulders burning with a fire of their own. Each stone was a small victory. Each stone laid in place was a word in an argument I was having with the world. You said I could not do this. Here is another stone that says you were wrong. I used the broken box saw to fashion a new handle for the rusted axe head Josiah had left behind. The wood I chose was a piece of seasoned oak from his stack, dense and straight-grained. I shaped it with his hunting knife, whittling in the dim light of our single candle, shaving off thin curls of wood that fell around my feet like pale offerings. When the handle was fitted and the axe head was secured with a wedge, I carved from a scrap of hickory. I split the first log. The sound of the axe striking true was a satisfying, solid chunk that echoed off the cavern walls and came back to me like applause from the mountain itself. It was the first real sound of construction, the first note in what would become a minor and complicated song of building. For mortar, I followed Josiah's instructions precisely. He had documented a seam of slick gray clay near a slow drip of water deep in the back of the cave. I found it exactly where he described a vein of smooth, cold material that yielded to my fingers like butter. I mixed it with coarse sand from the cavern floor, and following his advice, a small amount of Bess's dung for binding. The mixture was crude and ugly, and it smelled of the earth and the animal, and my own sweat, but when it dried between the stones, it held firm. My hands were raw, the skin cracked and bleeding, caked in freezing mud that I could not fully wash away because water was too precious to waste on vanity. My mother sat propped against the cavern wall through all of this, wrapped in every blanket we possessed, watching me with those unblinking, hawk-sharp eyes. She was too weak for the heavy work. Her body had been failing for months before we were cast out. The slow deterioration of age accelerated by grief and cold, and the particular exhaustion of being unwanted. But her mind was a precision instrument, sharp and untouched by the decay of her body. She was the strategist of our survival. Pace yourself, Clara, she would say when she saw my shoulders slump and my head drop with exhaustion. Even the strongest tree grows slowly. You are not racing anyone. You are building something. There is a difference. She rationed our meager food with an expertise born of a lifetime of scarcity. A thin, watery gruel made from a handful of flour and a splash of Bess's milk cooked in our cast-iron pot for a tiny fire of wood shavings that I built each morning, just large enough to heat the pot and no larger. We could not afford to waste fuel on cooking when the fireplace was not yet built. Every stick, every splinter had to be accounted for. Mother measured our flour by the pinch. She divided our salt into daily portions so small they would not have covered a fingernail. She made each meal last, spooning the thin gruel into our mouths with a patience that turned eating into a kind of ceremony. "It is not enough," she said one evening, watching me scrape the last of the gruel from the pot with my finger. "But it is something, and something is the difference between alive and dead." The biggest challenge was the chimney. The natural fissure in the rock was there, just as Josiah had described, a crack in the ceiling of the cavern that snaked upward through the stone to some opening on the mountainside above. It was a natural chimney, a gift from the geology of the mountain, but it was useless without a properly built hearth and flue to direct the smoke into it. The connection between hearth and fissure had to be precise. Too loose and the smoke would pour back into the cavern. Too tight and the draw would be insufficient to pull the hot air upward. My first attempt was a failure. I built the hearth over the course of 2 days, stacking stones and mortaring them with painstaking care, checking and rechecking Josiah's diagrams by candlelight, trying to match the angles and proportions he had sketched in his spidery hand. When it was done, I stood back and looked at it with something approaching pride. It was rough, yes, uneven in places. But it was a fireplace, the first one I had ever built, and it looked solid enough to hold. I laid kindling in the firebox. Small, dry splinters at the bottom, larger pieces stacked above them in the pattern James had taught me years ago, a pattern he used when starting the fire in our cabin on cold mornings. I struck a match. The kindling caught. Small yellow flames began to lick at the larger pieces, and for a moment the cavern was filled with the beautiful sound of crackling wood and the smell of burning pine. Then the smoke came. Not up the chimney, but outward, pouring from the mouth of the hearth in thick, choking clouds that filled the cavern within seconds. It hit us like a wall. My eyes burned. My lungs seized. My mother began to cough, a terrible racking sound that shook her entire frail body. Bess bellowed in panic, her hooves scrambling on the stone as she tried to back away from the smoke. I kicked the burning wood apart, scattering it across the stone floor, and stamped out the flames with my boots. Then I grabbed my mother under the arms and dragged her toward the entrance passage, both of us coughing and gasping, tears streaming down our faces. Bess followed, pushing past us in her terror, her great body nearly knocking me off my feet. We huddled near the cave mouth for an hour, breathing the clean, frozen air from outside, while the smoke slowly cleared from the cavern behind us. My mother said nothing. She did not need to. The failure spoke for itself. I sat with my back against the cold stone, the taste of smoke and defeat bitter in my mouth, and I felt something I had not allowed myself to feel since the council meeting. I felt like giving up. The mountain does not care about your feelings, Clara. It does not care about your pride or your grief or your plans. It is stone. It will be here long after you are gone. You cannot defeat it. You can only learn to live inside it. I do not know if my mother actually said those words that night, or if I am remembering them from some other time, some other conversation. Memory is unreliable in extremity. What I know is that I opened Josiah Crane's journal again, holding it close to our single candle, and I found the passage I needed. The smoke follows the heat. If it fills the room, your draw is weak. The opening must be taller than it is wide. A square opening is a dead opening. Make it a tall rectangle. Narrow the throat. The smoke must have only one path, and that path must go up. I had built the opening square. That was the error. A simple, fundamental mistake that had nearly killed us. I went back into the cavern the next morning with a fury that surprised me. I tore down the stones I had so carefully laid, ripping apart 2 days of work in less than an hour. The mortar crumbled. The stones scattered across the floor. Everything I had built was rubble, and from that rubble I began again. This time I followed Josiah's diagram with the devotion of a woman reading scripture. I made the opening a tall rectangle nearly twice as high as it was wide. I narrowed the throat where the firebox met the flue, creating a bottleneck that would accelerate the rising air. I sealed every crack, every gap, every imperfection with layer upon layer of clay mortar, pressing it into the joints with my thumbs until my hands were raw and my fingerprints were worn smooth. I checked each stone for stability before setting the next. I measured angles by eye and by feel, my hands learning a new language with every hour that passed. It took 3 more days. 3 days of lifting and fitting and mortaring and checking and rechecking. 3 days of my mother watching from her corner, offering quiet corrections when she saw something that did not look right. A little more mortar on that left side, Clara. That stone is not level. Do you see how it tilts? If you leave it, the one above it will tilt too, and the whole thing will come down by spring. On the evening of the third day, I knelt before the newly constructed hearth. My heart was hammering against my ribs. My hands were shaking, and not from the cold. I had prepared the kindling with obsessive care, selecting each piece for dryness and size, arranging them in a careful architecture of combustion. If this failed, I did not know if I had the strength to try a third time. I did not know if we had enough food left to survive another 3 days of building. I struck a match. The small flare seemed impossibly bright in the gloom. I touched it to the kindling and watched the first tiny flame take hold, a fragile orange tongue that licked at the wood with tentative hunger. Larger pieces caught. The fire grew. Smoke began to curl from the flames, drifting toward the mouth of the hearth, and my heart sank. But then it hesitated. The thin gray ribbon of smoke paused as if deciding, and then it was pulled upward. Gently at first, then with increasing conviction, a steady draft took hold. The smoke straightened into a column, thin and purposeful, and rose into the flue and vanished into the dark fissure above. A low, contented roar began to emanate from the fire, the sound of air being drawn in from below and pushed upward through the stone, and then came the warmth. It did not come all at once. It came as a wave, a gentle, radiant pressure that pushed against the deep cold of the cavern, the way a river pushes against a dam slowly, and then all at once. It reached my face first, a warm hand laid against my frozen cheek, then my chest, then my arms, my legs, the core of my body, where the cold had lived for so long that I had forgotten what its absence felt like. I heard a sound behind me and turned. My mother was crying, not sobbing, not weeping, but simply releasing tears that traced slow paths through the grime on her hollow cheeks. She reached out one frail hand toward me, her fingers trembling. "The smoke goes up," she whispered. Her voice was filled with something I had not heard in months. It was awe. "You did it, child. You built a hearth inside a mountain. Your father could not build a fence that stood through April, and you built a hearth inside a mountain." I crawled to her and we held each other. Her body was so thin I could feel every rib through the blankets, and she shook in my arms, not from cold, but from something more fundamental, from the release of a fear she had been carrying silently since the day we left town. She had believed we would die here. She had not said it, had not shown. It had kept her counsel and her courage and her quiet advice flowing, because that was what mothers do. But she had believed it, and now with the warmth spreading around us and the smoke rising obediently into the stone above, she allowed herself to believe something else. Bess ambled closer, drawn by the heat, and settled onto the ground with a deep, contented sigh. Her great brown eyes reflected the dancing flames, and she laid her massive head on the stone floor, with the air of a creature who has finally come home after a long and uncertain journey. That first night by the fire, we barely slept. We watched the flames, we listened to the quiet roar of the draw. We felt the warmth settle into our bones and our muscles, and the deep places inside us where the cold had taken root. The light threw our shadows across the cavern walls, huge and strange, the shadows of giants. We were just two women and a cow hidden in the belly of a mountain, but we were alive. We were warm, and I felt something I had not felt since James died. Not happiness, not yet, but a quiet, fierce pride that burned in my chest like an ember. I had looked into the face of a merciless winter, and I had not blinked. I had taken a cold, dead space, and I had given it a warm, beating heart. The fire was more than heat. It was a declaration. It was proof that I was not a liability. I was a builder. I was a survivor. And the world outside could freeze solid for all I cared. We had everything we needed right here. That night, as the fire settled into a steady, reliable burn, and the cavern walls glowed with a warmth they had not known in 17 years, my mother asked me to make her a cup of tea. I had forgotten about the tea. Ruth Crawford's gift, the small bundle of dried leaves pressed into my hand on the day of our exile. I had carried it in my pocket all the way up the mountain through the snow and the wind and the despair and the rage, and I had never opened it because there had been no hot water to brew it in and no moment peaceful enough to drink it. Now there was both. I heated water in our pot over the fire and crumbled the tea leaves in, and the smell that rose from the liquid was so achingly civilized, so absurdly normal, that I nearly laughed. We passed the cup between us, taking small sips, and the tea was strong and bitter and slightly stale, and it was the finest thing I had ever tasted. We drank it in silence, the fire crackling, The cave breathing its warm breath around us, and in that silence there was no grief and no anger and no fear. There was only this: two women sharing a cup of tea by a fire in the heart of a mountain. It was everything. It was enough. The days that followed settled into a rhythm dictated by the fire and our needs. My mother, strengthened by the steady warmth, became the keeper of our world. She discovered that the snowmelt dripping from the ceiling in one corner was pure and clean, giving us fresh water without the danger of venturing outside. She taught me to render tallow from our small store of salted pork, to make crude candles that burned without smoke, saving our precious lantern oil for emergencies. Waste nothing, Clara. She said, her practiced hands showing me how to twist a thread for a wick. The wilderness does not forgive waste. Her knowledge was a different kind of inheritance, passed from her own mother and from her mother before that. The accumulated wisdom of women who had always known how to make something from nothing, how to stretch a resource to its absolute limit, how to find use in what others would discard. While I was the body providing the physical labor to keep us alive, she was the mind, ensuring our efforts were not squandered. Bess was our third partner. Her body heat helped warm our corner of the cavern. Her milk, though it dwindled as the winter ground on and we had little to feed her besides dried moss, I scraped from the deeper tunnels, was a daily luxury. A few warm swallows each morning, rich and sweet and achingly normal. I would press my forehead against her flank as I milked her and talked to her in a low voice, telling her about the weather outside, about what I planned to build next, about James. She never answered, but her quiet, placid breathing was a comfort that no human words could have matched. We were a strange trinity, the daughter, the mother, and the beast, each providing something the others could not. I spent my days exploring deeper into the cave system, always with a candle, always with a piece of chalk to mark my path on the wall so I could find my way back. The darkness beyond our firelit chamber was absolute, the kind of darkness that has weight and texture that presses against your eyes until you begin to see things that are not there. But I pushed into it because Josiah's journal mentioned other resources, and I found them one by one, each discovery a small miracle that extended our survival by days, by weeks. First came the hidden cache. Tucked into a crevice in a side passage wrapped in oilcloth that had grown brittle with age but still held, was a collection of dried beans and strips of smoked fish. The fish was hard as wood and tasted of salt and thyme, but when soaked in warm water and cooked in our pot, it became something approaching food. The beans were better. They swelled in the water and released a starchy richness that made our thin gruel taste almost like a meal. I rationed them carefully, adding a handful to the pot each day, watching them bob in the watery broth like small promises. Then came the coal. In a side passage that branched off to the left, about 100 yards from our main chamber, I found a seam of soft, crumbly black material embedded in the rock wall. Coal. Not the hard, glassy anthracite of the deep mines, but a softer variety that crumbled in my hands and stained my fingers black. When I brought a lump back to the hearth and placed it on the fire, it caught slowly, then burned with an intensity that surprised me. It burned hotter than wood and lasted twice as long, and it pushed the temperature in our stone room up by several degrees. Each piece of coal I prized from that seam was a small fortune, measured not in dollars but in hours of warmth. Then the mushrooms. Pale, ghostly things growing in clusters near a warm spring I found deep in the mountain's belly, where hot water seeped from the rock and created a small pool of tepid, mineral-rich water. The mushrooms grew on the damp stone above the pool, their caps white and smooth, their stems thick. I was cautious. I knew that some mushrooms could kill, and dying of poison in a cave would be an especially pathetic end to our story. But Josiah's journal described them. White caps, thick stems growing near the warm seep. They taste of nothing, but they fill the belly. I have eaten them for 3 years, and I am still here. I trusted the dead man's testimony and ate one. It tasted of dampness and stone and absolutely nothing else. But it did not kill me, and the next day I gathered a handful and added them to our pot. The warm spring itself was another gift. The water was not hot enough to bathe in comfortably, but it was warm enough to wash my hands and face without the shock of ice water, and the relief of that small luxury was disproportionate to its actual significance. I would kneel beside the pool in the lantern light and cup the tepid water in my hands and press it to my face and feel for a brief moment something close to normal. something close to the woman I had been before the council meeting and the mountain and the cave. The warm water also meant I could wash our clothes, such as they were, and hang them to dry near the fire, and the act of wearing clean cloth against my skin felt like putting on armor. Each discovery was a gift from the ghost of Josiah Crane. His practical wisdom reaching across 17 years of silence to keep two strangers alive. Each night I read from his journal by the fire. I read aloud for my mother's benefit and for my own, and the words of a man I had never met became the most important voice in my life after my mother's. His story unfolded slowly across the pages revealed in fragments, between the practical entries about firewood quantities and water sources and the behavior of drafts in different weather conditions. Josiah Crane was a veteran of the Civil War. He had fought for the Union, a private in the 83rd Pennsylvania Infantry, and he had been wounded at Gettysburg in July of 1863. A Confederate bullet had torn through his left thigh, shattering the bone and leaving him with a permanent limp and a leg that ached in cold weather, with a ferocity he described as having a second heartbeat made of broken glass. He spent 6 months in a field hospital where the surgeons debated amputating the leg 3 separate times before deciding it might heal on its own. It did heal after a fashion. He could walk, but he could not run, could not climb, could not do any of the physical work that defined a man's usefulness on the frontier. He returned to his town in Pennsylvania and found himself surplus to requirements. Not hated, not driven out by any formal decree. Simply made invisible. No one hired a carpenter who could not climb a ladder. No one needed a farmhand who could not walk a furrow without stumbling. The charity of his neighbors lasted one winter. By the second, the invitations to dinner stopped. By the third, people crossed the street when they saw him coming, not out of malice, but out of the discomfort that comes from witnessing need you have decided not to meet. He left Pennsylvania in the spring of 1871 and walked west. He did not say where he was going because he did not know. He only knew he was leaving. He carried a bedroll, a hunting knife, a small axe, and the journal in which he would document everything that followed. He walked for weeks following rivers and railroad grades, sleeping rough, eating what he could trap or forage. His leg ached constantly, a grinding, relentless pain that he treated with nothing but willpower and the occasional splash of whiskey when he could get it. He wrote about the journey with a matter-of-fact stoicism that I found both admirable and heartbreaking. "The pain is worse today," read one entry from somewhere in Ohio. "The road is mud, and every step is a negotiation with a leg that wants to quit. But I will not quit. Quitting is for men who have somewhere to go back to. I have burned that bridge. Forward is the only direction left." Another entry from further west said simply, "Saw a family in a wagon today. 2 children. The boy waved at me. I waved back. That is the most human contact I have had in 11 days." He found the cave by accident, sheltering from a late spring storm that caught him on the mountain, and he never left. For 7 years, he lived inside Ridgeback Mountain alone with his tools and his thoughts, and his stubborn refusal to accept the verdict the world had passed on him. He mapped every passage. He tested every theory about the cave's thermal properties. He failed and rebuilt just as I had with the hearth. His journal was the record of those failures and those triumphs written in the honest, unsentimental voice of a man who had no one to impress and no reason to lie. One entry stopped me cold. I read it 3 times before I could speak. The words blurred and sharpened and blurred again through the tears I could not stop. "If someone finds this place after me, I want them to know it is not a dead end. It is a beginning. I have left everything I could. The wood, the tools, the coal. This journal. I have no family to leave it to. No son, no daughter, no wife. But perhaps that does not matter. Perhaps inheritance is not about blood. Perhaps it is about need. If you are reading this, you needed this place. And so it is yours. You are not alone. I was here before you." I closed the journal. The fire crackled in the silence. My mother was watching me from her blankets, her eyes bright and wet in the flickering light. "He did not leave that for just anyone," she said quietly. "He left it for you, Clara. He just did not know your name." I built a low stone wall around our living area, creating a room within the cavern, just as Josiah had suggested in his journal. It trapped the heat from the fire and created a small, almost comfortable space where the temperature stayed warm enough that we could remove our outer layers without shivering. I fashioned a crude door from scavenged planks and a piece of cowhide sealing us in. Inside our little stone enclosure with the fire roaring and a candle burning on a ledge I had chipped into the wall, it began to feel less like a cave and more like a home. Rough, yes. Primitive, certainly. But ours. Built with our hands and our will, and the guidance of a man who had walked this same path before us. The winter deepened into something monstrous. Blizzards raged for days on end, burying the world outside in a sea of white so vast and so featureless that it erased the very concept of landscape. From the mouth of our cave, we could hear the wind howling, like a living thing denied entry, a banshee wail that would have been our death song just weeks before. But inside our fortress of stone and fire, we were beyond its reach. The mountain protected us. The fire warmed us. The ghost of Josiah Crane guided us. And my mother, with her watchful eyes and her quiet wisdom, kept us sane. Then one afternoon, during a brief lull between storms, a figure appeared at the cave mouth. I heard the crunch of boots on snow before I saw him. I reached for the axe and moved to the entrance passage, my heart pounding. No one should have been this high on the mountain in this weather. No one with good intentions. The man who stood blinking in the dim light of the cave entrance was Emmett Gaines, a hunter from Corbin Falls. His face was gaunt, hollowed by weeks of short rations, and his eyes were wide with a disbelief that bordered on fear. He had been tracking a deer across the upper ridges and had seen the faint wisp of smoke rising from the mountainside, a ghost of white against the gray sky that should not have been there. Clara, he stammered, his gaze moving past me into the gloom of the passage. By God, we all thought you were dead. Both of you, the whole town. They said prayers for you at Christmas. He stepped inside and I watched his expression change as his eyes adjusted and he took in what I had built. The roaring fire, the neat stack of wood, the stone wall, the placid cow lying by the hearth. He had come expecting to find frozen bodies curled together in the dark. He had found a home. I gave him a cup of warm milk and let him sit by the fire for an hour. He said little. He kept looking around the cavern, shaking his head, touching the stone wall with his fingertips as though testing whether it was real. When he left, he carried with him a story that would change everything. Word travels fast in small towns, even in the dead of winter. Within days, others came. They did not come to offer help or to express relief that we were alive. They came with hard, desperate eyes, the eyes of people who believe someone is keeping a secret from them. The winter had been as brutal as predicted. Livestock had died by the dozens. Feed stores were running dangerously low. Fear had settled over Corbin Falls like a second winter, colder and more pervasive than the first. Heard you found a gold seam in here, one man said, his gaze scanning the cavern walls with open greed as though he might spot a vein of yellow metal winking at him from the shadows. How much food you got stored up, another demanded, his tone more accusation than question. Town is nearly out of flour. People are getting desperate, Clara. You sitting up here fat and warm while children go hungry down below. The injustice of it burned in my chest like a hot coal. These were the same people who had watched me drag my dying mother through the snow. The same people who had closed their curtains and looked away, while I pulled a sled loaded with everything I owned past their windows and into the wilderness. And now they stood in the home I had built with bleeding hands and cracking bones, and they had the audacity to call me selfish for surviving. But the man who frightened me most was not merely hungry or desperate. He was something worse. He was angry in the way that only a man who blames the world for his own failures can be angry with a rage that has no target and therefore attacks everything. His name was Elias Cobb, a failed prospector with a broad chest and small eyes set deep in a face that looked like it had been carved from the same granite as the mountain. He had spent 3 years digging holes in the hills around Corbin Falls, finding nothing but disappointment and debt, and the name Fool's Hollow had lodged in his brain like a splinter he could not remove. He was convinced the cave held gold. He was convinced I had found it. And he was convinced that a woman had no right to keep what a man could take. He came with 2 other men, both armed with rifles slung across their backs, with the casual menace of men who want you to know they are carrying weapons without having to say so. They did not knock on my makeshift door. They did not call out a greeting. They pushed past me into the cavern with the confidence of men who believe that physical strength is the same thing as moral right. "Step aside," Cobb said. His voice was flat and hard, a voice that had never learned the art of asking because it had always gotten what it wanted through taking. We are going to have a look around. You can either show us what you have found, or we will find it ourselves. Makes no difference to me. I stood my ground. I was half his size and unarmed, and my heart was beating so hard I was certain he could hear it. There is no gold here, I said. There is nothing here but stone and firewood, and two women trying to survive the winter. You are welcome to warm yourself by the fire for an hour, but you will not go deeper into this cave. Cobb did not believe me. He did not even consider believing me. He shoved me aside with one thick arm the way you would push a curtain out of your path and started toward the deeper passages, his torch held high, his companions falling in behind him. The shadows leaped and danced on the walls as they moved, making the cave seem suddenly alien and threatening, as though their presence had disturbed something that preferred to be left alone. And then my mother spoke. Her voice came from the shadows by the fire, quiet and dry and utterly calm. It was the voice of a woman who had spent 70 years learning exactly how much authority could be packed into a whisper. It cut through the tension in the cavern the way a blade cuts through rope, not with force but with precision. If you go past the third turning, without chalk marks on the wall, she said, you will never find your way back. This cave has 47 forks. I have counted them. The bones of the last man who went in without a guide are still in there somewhere in the dark, waiting for company. It was a lie, a magnificent, audacious, perfectly delivered lie. My mother had never ventured deeper than our living area. She had no idea how many forks the cave contained. She could not have counted them because she could barely walk 10 steps without resting. But she spoke with the absolute, unshakable certainty of a woman who had raised a child alone in a hard country and had learned that the truth is less important than the telling of it. She knew how to make men listen, and more importantly, she knew how to make them afraid. Cobb stopped. His torch flickered in a draft that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The two men behind him exchanged glances, and I saw something shift in their eyes. The cave, which moments before had seemed like a simple hole in a mountain, suddenly felt vast and complex and unknowable. The darkness beyond the reach of their torchlight seemed to deepen to breathe the weight. Cobb turned back. His jaw was tight, his small eyes burning with suspicion and a frustration that bordered on fury. But underneath the anger, I saw what my mother had put there. Doubt. He was not a fool despite his foolishness. He was a bully, and bullies require certainty the way fire requires oxygen. My mother had starved him of it. This is not over, he said, pointing his finger at me like a weapon. I will be back, and next time I will not be asking. He left. The two men followed, their boots crunching on the stone, their shadows shrinking on the walls as they retreated toward the cave mouth and the cold white world beyond. I stood in the entrance passage until their footsteps faded into silence. Then I went to my mother and knelt beside her. 47 forks, I said. She shrugged, a tiny movement of her bony shoulders beneath the blankets. It could be 47. It could be 4. He does not know the difference, and his fear will do the counting for him. That night, I did not sleep. I lay beside the fire and listened to the wind and thought about Elias Cobb and the look in his eyes and the promise in his voice. He would come back. Men like him always did. Their pride would not allow them to be turned away by an old woman's bluff, no matter how convincing. The question was not whether he would return, but when and whether I would be ready. I also thought about what would have happened if my mother had not spoken. If she had stayed silent in her blankets and let Cobb walk into the deeper passages unchallenged. Would he have found gold? There was no gold. But he might have found the coal seam, and he might have found the food cache, and he might have decided that these things were his by right of discovery and strength. He might have decided that two women had no claim to anything a man with a rifle wanted, and he might have been right in the brutal calculus of the frontier where ownership belonged to whoever could hold a thing against all comers. But my mother had spoken, and in speaking, she had reminded me of something I had nearly forgotten. That strength is not only in the arms and the back and the hands. It is in the voice. It is in the mind. It is in the willingness to look a dangerous man in the eye and tell him a lie so convincing that he cannot distinguish it from truth. My mother, who could not lift a stone or swing an axe, had driven 3 armed men from our home with nothing but words and the authority of a woman who had stopped being afraid of men a very long time ago. Before dawn, I began building. Not a hearth this time, but a wall. A defensive wall across the narrowest point of the entrance passage where the rock pinched together and the ceiling dropped low. I used the largest stones I could move, dragging them from the main cavern and fitting them together with the same clay mortar that held our fireplace. I built it waist high and left only a gap wide enough for one person to pass through at a time, turning the narrow passage into a bottleneck that no number of armed men could rush through without becoming, for a critical moment, a single-file target. It would not stop a determined assault, but it would slow one down. And in that narrow space where only one man could stand abreast, numbers meant nothing. One woman with an axe behind a stone wall was not a victim. She was a fortification. As I worked fitting stone to stone in the flickering lantern light, I thought about what my mother had said the night the first townspeople came asking for help. A shared crust is still a crust. A hoarded one turns to stone in your belly. She was right. She was almost always right about the things that mattered. The instinct to seal ourselves away, to hoard what little we had, and fortify our position and let the world fend for itself was powerful and seductive. These people had earned nothing from us. They had watched us leave to die. Where was their compassion when the sled was heavy and the wind was sharp and the mountain was high? Where were their shared crusts then? But my mother understood something I was still learning, that survival without compassion is just a slower kind of death, that the warmth of a fire means nothing if the heart beside it has gone cold, that you can build the strongest walls in the world and still lose everything worth protecting if you forget why you built them in the first place. So I made my choice. I finished the defensive wall because prudence is not the same as cruelty. But I also opened my door. I invited the hungry and the cold in two at a time to warm themselves by the fire for an hour. I gave each visitor a cup of warm, watered-down milk. I gave a small bag of our precious coal to a family whose newborn was sick with a lung fever, a baby whose cough was so small and so wet that it sounded like a kitten drowning, and I could not listen to that sound and do nothing, no matter how much resentment I carried. Some were grateful. They held the warm cup in both hands and closed their eyes and whispered words of thanks that sounded like prayers. Others took what I offered without acknowledgement, their eyes still hard with suspicion, still scanning the walls for the gold they were certain I had hidden. It did not matter. We were not sharing because we expected gratitude. We were sharing because my mother was right and because the alternative was to become Silas Crawford, a person who could look at suffering and see only arithmetic. In the heart of that unforgiving mountain in the belly of a cave, the world had written off as a dead end. We were learning a lesson the town below had forgotten. You cannot survive alone. Community is not a charter written on paper by men in a warm room. It is a cup of milk given to a stranger. It is a bag of coal handed to a mother whose baby is dying. It is the choice to share when everything in your body screams to hoard. That fire, that hearth I had built and rebuilt and bled over was our first great victory. But this, the opening of our door, the sharing of our warmth, was the greater one. Because the fire only kept our bodies alive. The sharing kept our souls alive. And in the end, that is the thing that matters most. Then the hardest season began. Not the winter outside, which was already breaking its own records for brutality, but the winter inside our cave. The winter I had been dreading since the moment we arrived. The winter of my mother's fading. The signs came slowly the way dawn comes in deep winter. Not all at once, but in small, almost imperceptible shifts that you only recognize when you look back and realize how much darkness has already given way. My mother stopped eating first. Not dramatically, not with any announcement or refusal. She simply began to leave a little more gruel in the bottom of the pot each morning, pushing it toward me with her spoon and saying she had already had enough when I knew she had barely touched it. She was rationing herself the way she had rationed our flour, quietly subtracting from her own portion so that mine might be a little larger. Then her hands changed. They had always been busy hands, even in the cave, twisting wicks for candles, sorting our diminishing stores of beans into daily portions with a precision that bordered on ritual, folding and refolding the blankets into more efficient configurations to trap heat. Her hands were her conversation with the world, her way of saying, I am still here, I am still useful, I still have something to offer. But now they rested in her lap more often, still and quiet, as though the tasks they had performed for 70 years were slowly releasing them from service. They lay there like tools that had been set down at the end of a long day, and the sight of them idle filled me with a dread that no amount of firewood could warm away. She slept more, an hour more each day, then 2, then 3, until the time she spent awake was a small island in a vast sea of unconsciousness. I would sit beside her during those waking hours, hoarding each minute the way she had hoarded our salt, measuring it out carefully, savoring it, knowing that the supply was finite and dwindling. Her breathing changed too. It became softer, shallower, each exhale carrying less of her voice and more of her silence, as though she were gradually being translated from a language I could understand into one I could not. I would lie awake at night, listening to her breathe, counting the seconds between each inhalation, terrified of the silence that would eventually fill the gap. The sound of her breathing had become the heartbeat of our little stone room, as constant and as essential as the fire, and I knew that when it stopped, something fundamental about this place would stop with it. The hardship of the journey up the mountain and the long, dark months that followed had taken a toll that warmth and food could not repair. Her body, so frail to begin with, was simply worn out. The bones that had carried her through 70 winters had done all the carrying they could. She was a candle that had been burning at both ends for decades, giving light and warmth to everyone around her while consuming herself, and now the two flames were meeting in the middle. There was no illness to fight, no fever to break with wet rags and desperate prayer, no enemy to rage against. It was just time, the most patient and most merciless adversary of all. I felt the familiar, helpless grief begin to rise in me. The same grief I had felt when James was taken by the fever that moved faster than the doctor could ride. That drowning sensation, that feeling of standing on the bank of a river, watching someone you love being carried away by a current you cannot fight and cannot follow. But this was different from James. His death had been sudden, violent, a door slammed shut in my face without warning. My mother's dying was a slow, gentle closing. A hand releasing another hand finger by finger with tenderness and deliberation, as though she wanted to give me time to memorize the feeling of her grip before it was gone. In her waking hours, her mind remained as clear and sharp as the mountain air outside our cave. If anything, the nearness of death seemed to have burned away every unnecessary thought, every social nicety, every polite fiction, leaving only what was essential. She spoke with a directness that sometimes took my breath away, as though the filter between her thoughts and her words had finally dissolved, and what came through was pure and uncut, and sometimes almost too honest to bear. We talked more in those final weeks than we had in years, perhaps more than we had in our entire lives. Not about practical things, not about food stores or firewood or the weather or the 100 small decisions that survival demands. We talked about her life, about the woman she had been before she was my mother. She had always been my mother, first the role so total and so complete that I had never really thought about the person inside it the way you never really think about the walls of your house until they are no longer there. She told me about her own mother, a Swedish immigrant named Ingrid, who had crossed the Atlantic Ocean in the hold of a cargo ship at 17 years old alone, speaking no English, carrying nothing but a wool blanket and a Bible she could not read because it was printed in a language she had not yet learned. That woman had walked from the docks of New York to a small town in Ohio following the railroad tracks because someone on the waterfront had told her there was farmland in the West, and she had not known enough English to ask how far west was or what she would find when she got there. She walked for 6 weeks. She ate what she could find or beg. She slept in barns and under bridges, and once when there was no shelter at all under the open sky with her blanket pulled over her head and her Bible clutched to her chest like a shield. That woman became a farmer's wife and raised 5 children and never once complained about the hardship of her life because she had nothing to compare it to. For Ingrid, hardship was simply the texture of existence. It was not good or bad, it was just what was. And that understanding, my mother said, was the most valuable thing she had inherited. Not land, not money, not even love, though there had been love. But the understanding that life owes you nothing and that everything you receive is either earned or stolen, and that it is important to know the difference. She told me about my father, which she almost never did. His name was Henry Hargrove, and she spoke it that night without bitterness, without anger, without the careful neutrality she had always used when I asked about him as a child. She spoke it with a kind of exhausted understanding, the way you might speak the name of a storm that destroyed your house years ago. You no longer fear it. You no longer hate it. You simply acknowledge that it happened and that you rebuilt. He was not a cruel man, Clara, she said. He was a weak one. And weakness is harder to forgive than cruelty because at least cruelty has conviction behind it. At least a cruel man has decided something, even if what he has decided is terrible. Your father simply could not bear the weight of ordinary life. Some men cannot. They are built for fair weather and clear roads, and when the storms come and the roads turn to mud, they walk away. Not because they do not love you, but because they love their own comfort more. And comfort is a jealous God. It does not share. I asked her if she had ever thought about following him, about packing up and going after him and trying to hold the family together by force of will. She laughed. It was a dry, rustling sound like wind through dead leaves, but there was real humor in it, the kind that comes from looking at something absurd from a great distance. Follow him where, she said, into a life of being disappointed by a man who could not stay, into a future of watching him leave again and again each time, with a different excuse and the same result. No, Clara, I chose to stay with the person who needed me. That is always the right choice. Stay with the one who needs you. Everything else is running. She held my calloused, scarred hands in her own and turned them over, studying the new topography of blisters and cuts and rough skin that the cave had carved into them. Hands that had once been soft enough to thread a needle by candlelight were now the hands of a stonemason, thick and hard and mapped with scars. She traced the lines of my palms with one thin finger as though reading a story written in scar tissue. "These are good hands," she said one evening. Her voice was barely a whisper, but each word was placed with the precision of a woman who knew she did not have many words left and intended to waste none of them. "They know how to build. They know how to hold on. You got that from me, Clara. Not the building. I never built anything in my life except a child. But the holding on, that is mine. That is what I gave you." She never complained. Not once in all those final weeks. She did not speak of pain, though I knew she felt it in the mornings when her joints refused to bend and her back locked tight, and every movement cost her something she could not afford. She did not express fear, though she must have felt that too. Lying in the dark, listening to her own breathing slow, and knowing what that slowness meant. She did not mourn the life she was leaving, or at least she did not mourn it where I could hear. Her only concern, her only agenda in those dwindling days was me, making sure I was ready, making sure I was armored, making sure I understood who I was and what I was capable of. "Do not let them call you a burden again, Clara," she said one afternoon. The firelight was dancing on the cavern walls, throwing our shadows into a slow, ancient waltz. Her voice was thin, but her eyes were not. There was a flicker of the old fire in them, the steel that had carried her through 50 years of hard living and harder losing. "You carried me up this mountain on your back. You built this home from cold stone and dead wood and sheer stubbornness. You kept us alive when every man in that town had written us off as dead. You are the least burdensome person I've ever known. Promise me you will remember that. Promise me that the next time someone tries to tell you what you are, you will look them in the eye and tell them what you have done." I promised. I held her hand and promised, and I meant it with every broken, rebuilt, strengthened fiber of my being. Her last meaningful words to me came a few days before the end. She had been asleep most of the day, drifting in and out of a shallow unconsciousness that was neither sleep nor waking, but some gray country between the two, where the borders were blurred and the landscape was unfamiliar. I was sitting beside her, mending a tear in one of our blankets, with a bone needle and a thread pulled from the hem of my own dress, when her eyes opened with a sudden clarity that startled me. They were bright and focused and fully present, and for a moment she looked not like a dying woman, but like the fierce, indomitable mother who had raised me. "This is not a cave, Clara," she said. Her voice was stronger than it had been in days, almost conversational, as though she were commenting on the quality of the light or the temperature of the air. "It is a house. You made it a home. There is a difference between those two things that most people never understand. A house is walls and a roof. A home is what happens inside them. What you have done here is not survival. It is something much more important. It is proof that a home is not a place. It is a decision. You decided, Clara, and that is why we are here." She closed her eyes after that. She did not open them again with that same clarity. The last few days were quiet. She drifted further and further from the shore of consciousness, her breathing growing softer, the intervals between each breath stretching longer, like the spaces between the notes of a song that is reaching its final measures. I stayed beside her. I did not leave her side for more than the minutes it took to feed the fire and milk Bess and keep the small machinery of our survival turning. I held her hand and I talked to her, though I do not know if she heard me. I told her about the garden I would plant in the spring, about the seeds I would trade for when the snow melted. I told her about the herbs I had found growing in the deeper passages and how I would dry them and learn their uses. I told her what the sunrise looked like from the cave mouth on clear mornings, how the light caught the ice on the distant peaks and turned the whole world into a cathedral of gold and white. The end came on a quiet morning in late March. The air outside held the first scent of thaw, a faint earthy promise of melting snow, and returning life that drifted into the cave mouth like a visitor who was not sure whether to enter. I woke at dawn as I always did and reached for her hand. It was cool and still. Her face was peaceful, smoothed of every line of pain and worry and fierce determination, and she wore an expression I had never seen on her in life. It was not happiness exactly. It was completion. It was the face of a woman who has finished a very long and very difficult piece of work and can finally set down her tools and rest. She had died in her sleep beside the fire I had built in the home we had made together inside a mountain that the world had meant to be our grave. Her passing was as gentle as the cave around us. There was no struggle, no final rattle, no dramatic last breath, only a silence where breathing used to be. I sat with her for a long time, hours. The fire crackled and popped. Bess shifted in her corner and let out a low, mournful sound as though she understood that the third member of our trinity had departed. The grief was immense. It filled the cavern, the way smoke had filled it on the day the hearth failed, pressing into every corner, leaving no space untouched, no crack unfilled. But it was not a destructive grief. It did not consume me the way James's death had consumed me, that sudden violent burning that left nothing but ash. This grief was different. It was tempered with a gratitude so deep and so complete that it ached like a muscle that has been worked to its limit and beyond. We had been given this time. Against all odds, against the verdict of 14 men and the cruelty of a Wyoming winter and the indifference of a mountain, we had been given 3 more months together. We had faced the end not in shame and cold, at the edge of a town that did not want us, but in warmth and dignity and love, in a home we had carved from the living rock with our own hands. That was not failure. That was victory. The most important victory either of us had ever won. I buried her in a small, sheltered alcove deep in the cave system, a quiet, solemn place where the stone was smooth and warm, and the air smelled of clean mineral water, and the darkness felt not oppressive, but protective, the darkness of a cathedral rather than a coffin. I wrapped her in the blanket she had folded so carefully on the day we left our cabin, the same blanket she had smoothed with her hands in that deliberate way of hers, and I laid her on a bed of dried moss and covered her with stones. I selected each stone for its smoothness and its weight, placing them with a tenderness that I could not have explained to anyone who had not loved someone the way I loved her. I said no prayer over her grave, not because I had lost my faith entirely, but because every prayer I knew had been written by men, and my mother deserved words that came from a woman who knew her. So instead I spoke to her directly in the silence of the cave, the way I had spoken to her every day of my life. I told her she was the bravest person I had ever known. I told her that the gruel she made from nearly nothing had kept us alive. I told her that her 47 imaginary forks had saved us from Elias Cobb. I told her that I would keep the fire burning and the door open and the journal filled, and that everything I did from this moment forward would be because of what she had given me. Then I placed the last stone and stood there for a long time, my hand resting on the cairn, feeling the warmth of the rock beneath my palm. The mountain that had been our salvation would now be her resting place. She would sleep in the warmth we had fought so hard to find, and the cold would never touch her again. The loss of her presence left a void that nothing could fill. The stone room felt larger without her and emptier, and the shadows gathered more thickly in the corners where she used to sit. Her blanket still held the shape of her body. Her cup still sat on the ledge where she had placed it. These small artifacts of a life recently lived were everywhere I looked, and each one was a small knife that cut a little deeper every time I noticed it. But her wisdom remained. It was embedded in the stones of the hearth she had helped me build. It was in the clean water she had discovered. It was in the careful habits of rationing and conservation that her hands had taught mine. It was in the quiet resolve that lived in my chest like a second heart, beating steadily, pumping, not blood, but purpose through my veins. Her death was not a failure. It was a transfer of responsibility. She had carried me for 29 years, had shaped me and strengthened me and armed me with everything she had. Now it was my turn to carry what she had given me forward. Not as a burden, never as a burden, but as a torch. When the snows melted enough for the path to be safe, I walked down the mountain. The world was bursting with the messy, violent, gorgeous life of spring. Water ran everywhere, cascading down the mountainside in silver threads that caught the sunlight and threw it back in fragments, pooling in meadows that were already flushing green with the first tentative shoots of new growth. Birds I had not heard in months were singing with an urgency that sounded almost desperate, as though they too had survived something terrible and needed to announce their continued existence to anyone who would listen. The town of Corbin Falls looked smaller than I remembered, diminished, humbled. The buildings that had seemed so solid and permanent in December, so certain of their own importance, now looked fragile and battered, hunched against the mud, like old men who have been through a war and are not sure yet whether they have won or lost. The winter had been hard on them. I could see it in the sagging roof lines where snow had pushed the beams past their limits, in the gaps in fences where posts had been pulled up and burned for fuel, in the thin, wary faces of the people who emerged from their homes to watch me walk down the main street. I was thinner than when I had left. My face was weathered by months of smoke and cold, and labor my skin darkened and roughened, my cheeks hollow. My clothes were little more than patched rags held together by stubbornness, and the thread I had pulled from hems and seams to mend the worst of the tears. My hands were scarred and thick with callus, the hands of a stonemason, a carpenter, a woman who had learned to speak the language of granite and oak. But I walked with my head high and my back straight and my eyes level, and I did not look away from a single face that turned toward me. Silas Crawford saw me from the porch of his mercantile. He had aged a decade in 3 months. His face was gaunt, the flesh drawn tight over the bones, his clothes hanging loose on a frame that had lost weight it could not spare. His eyes, always sharp and calculating, had a haunted quality. Now the look of a man who has been alone with his thoughts for too long and has not enjoyed the company. He gripped the porch railing with both hands when he saw me, and his knuckles went white. He did not speak. He did not call out a greeting or an apology or an explanation. He simply stood there, and I simply walked past, and between us there was a silence that said everything that words could not. I did not need his apology. An apology would have been for his benefit, not mine. It would have eased his conscience without changing a single thing about what he had done. My survival was its own reckoning. It was a verdict that no council could overturn and no charter could nullify. I was alive, and I had kept my mother alive long enough for her to die with dignity, and that was a judgment against Silas Crawford more damning than any words I could have spoken. I went into the mercantile to trade. I had pelts, rabbit, and deer that I had cured over the winter, using techniques Josiah had described in his journal. I traded them for salt flour and seeds. Vegetable seeds mostly, carrots and potatoes and beans. Things that would grow in the thin, rocky soil near the cave mouth where the sun hit for a few hours each afternoon. I was leaving the store when Ruth Crawford walked in. She stopped in the doorway, and for a long moment, we simply looked at each other across the narrow space of the mercantile, across the counter where her husband counted his profits and calculated his costs, across the gap between a woman who had been freed by exile and a woman who was still imprisoned by propriety. I knew he was wrong, Ruth said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were bright with something that might have been tears, or might have been anger, or might have been both. I knew it the night of the meeting. I have known it every day since. Every morning I wake up in that house, and I think about you on that mountain, and I feel something I do not have a word for. It is not guilt exactly. It is more like shame for a crime I did not commit, but did not prevent. Then why did you not speak? I asked. Not with accusation. I had no anger left for Ruth Crawford. I had spent all my anger on the mountain and the stone and the cold, and what was left was something cleaner and less corrosive. Curiosity, perhaps, or compassion. She looked at me for a long time before answering. Her mouth opened and closed once, twice, as though the words kept forming and then retreating. Finally, she spoke. Because I am a burden too, Clara. In my own house, a woman who disagrees with her husband is not a partner. She is a problem, and problems in Silas Crawford's world get solved the same way you were solved. They get removed, not to a mountain, not to the cold, but to silence, to invisibility, to the back of the room where no one can hear you and no one has to look at you. I understood then fully and completely what the tea and the soap had meant. They were not charity. They were not even kindness exactly. They were a message passed from one cage to another, a hand reaching through the bars. I see you. I cannot free you because I cannot even free myself. But I see you, and being seen sometimes is enough to keep a person alive. I did not return to Corbin Falls that day. I climbed back up my mountain following the path that my own feet had worn into the snow over the course of the winter, a path that was now beginning to show the first patches of bare earth. I stood at the cave mouth and looked out at the world below. The valley was greening. The river was swelling with snowmelt. The town was stirring back to life after its long hibernation. And I stood above it all on the mountain that had tried to kill me and had instead become my home, and I felt something I can only describe as belonging. Not to the town, not to any group of people or any set of rules or any charter written on paper, but to this place, to this stone, to this cave that breathed. I learned later that spring what had become of Elias Cobb. He never made good on his threat to return. Not because he found his courage wanting, but because the mountain found him first. He had gone prospecting alone in a side canyon of Ridgeback 2 weeks after his visit to our cave, convinced that the gold was out there somewhere, that the mountain owed him something for his years of fruitless digging. A late February avalanche buried the canyon trail behind him, and he spent 4 days trapped in a shallow overhang with no fire and no food before a search party found him half frozen, his fingers blackened with frostbite. He lost 3 fingers on his left hand and the last of his bluster. I saw him once more in town that same spring. He was loading supplies onto a mule heading east. He did not look at me. He did not look at anyone. The mountain had answered his threat with one of its own, and unlike my mother's bluff, this one had teeth. I planted my garden that spring, a small patch of cleared earth near the cave mouth where the soil was rich with centuries of decomposed leaf fall, and the sun found its way for several hours each afternoon. I turned the earth with a spade I fashioned from a flat stone and a wooden handle, breaking up the dark, loamy soil and pulling out the roots and rocks that cluttered it. The work was familiar in a way that surprised me. It felt like coming home to a part of myself I had thought was dead, the part that had kept a kitchen garden behind the cabin and had known the satisfaction of pulling a carrot from the ground and brushing the dirt from its orange skin, and knowing that I had made this, I had grown this from nothing. I planted my seeds in careful rows, spacing them according to memories of my mother's instructions from years ago. Instructions she had given me when I was a girl, standing beside her in our garden, with dirt under my fingernails and the sun warm on my back. I watered them from the snowmelt I collected in pots and carried to the surface. Each trip up and down the cave passage, a small pilgrimage of faith. The first green shoots appeared 2 weeks later, pushing up through the dark soil like tiny fists raised in defiance, and I understood for the first time why farmers weep when the crops come in. It is not sentimentality. It is relief. It is the physical evidence that something you planted in faith, intended with labor, has chosen to live. It is a small resurrection repeated every spring, and no matter how many times you witness it, it never loses its power to astonish. That next winter, a miner named Hank Dawson lost everything he had when his cabin caught fire in the middle of a December night. He and his wife Nettie had barely escaped with their lives, stumbling out into the snow in their night clothes, while everything they owned went up in flames that turned the snow orange for 100 yards in every direction. Hank had burns on his right leg that went deep, raw wounds that wet fluid and refused to close in the cold. The town offered them a cot in the back of the livery stable, which was generous by the standards of men who calculated the value of compassion against the cost of feed. I offered them my home. I did not hesitate. I did not weigh the costs or calculate the risks or consult any charter or any counsel. I simply walked to the livery stable where they were shivering on a cot that smelled of horse and hay and said, "Come with me. I have a warm place." Nettie looked at me with eyes that held the specific terror of a woman who has watched everything she owns turn to ash and does not yet know if the world contains anything solid enough to stand on. Hank said nothing. His jaw was clenched so tight against the pain in his leg that I could see the muscles standing out like cords beneath his skin. I led them up the mountain path, the same path I had stumbled up a year earlier with my mother on a sled and despair in my heart. The path was easier now. I had worn it smooth with a year of daily trips hauling water and firewood and the vegetables from my garden. But for Nettie and Hank, it was an ordeal. Nettie leaned on me the way my mother had leaned on me, and Hank limped behind us, his burned leg wrapped in rags, his teeth clenched against the pain, his pride fighting a losing battle against his need. I knew that fight. I had fought it myself on this same mountainside in colder weather with heavier stakes. I did not rush them. I did not offer empty comfort. I simply walked beside them and let the mountain do what the mountain does, which is to make you earn every step and then reward you for the earning. I brought them into the warmth of the cavern, and I showed them the fire and the wall and the water and the coal. I showed Nettie how the draw worked, how the stones held the heat, how the mountain breathed. I fed them soup made from my garden's preserved stores, from the jars of vegetables I had spent all summer drying and pickling and putting up against the winter. They stayed until spring, until Hank's leg healed enough for him to walk without wincing, and they had the will and the means to rebuild. On the day they left, Nettie held my hands in hers the way my mother used to hold them, and she looked at the calluses and the scars, and she said, "These hands saved us. I will not forget." The year after that, a family arrived in Corbin Falls in late October. A couple named Walker with 3 young children, the oldest, barely 6, who had come west on promises of cheap land and opportunity and had arrived just in time for the killing season. They had no stores laid up, no proper shelter, no understanding of what a Wyoming winter could do to people who were not prepared for it. By December, they were starving, the children gaunt and listless, the parents wild-eyed with a terror that went beyond hunger into something primal and animal. I brought them up the mountain too. I fed them and warmed them and taught them, and when spring came, they went back down to the valley with the knowledge they needed to survive and the memory of a cave that had held them when nothing else would. The cave was no longer Fool's Hollow. People stopped calling it that, and the new name spread through the region the way Emmett Gaines's story had spread through Corbin Falls, quickly and quietly, and with a kind of reverent inevitability. They called it the shelter. And the name carried a weight that went beyond its simple meaning. It was not just a place where you went to get out of the cold. It was a testament, a proof, a living argument against the idea that the world's judgment is final. I kept the journal updated through all of this. Every family that came, I wrote down their names and their stories and what had brought them to my door. Not because I wanted a record of my own generosity, but because I wanted the next person who found this journal to know that they were not the first and would not be the last. That the cave had a history of saving people, and that history was longer than any one life. The Walker children drew pictures on the cave walls with charcoal from the fire stick figures of their family standing beneath a mountain smiling. I left the drawings there. They were as much a part of the cave's story as Josiah's measurements and my mother's candle-making instructions. I learned things in those years that no book could have taught me. I learned that people who have lost everything often cannot accept help without shame, and that the greatest kindness you can offer someone in that state is to give them work. So I put the people who sheltered with me to work. I had them chop wood and haul water and tend the fire, not because I needed the help, though I did, but because a person who is working does not feel like a charity case. They feel like a participant. They feel like they are earning their warmth, and that feeling is worth more than the warmth itself. In the third winter after our exile, Ruth Crawford appeared at my cave mouth. She was alone, her shawl pulled tight against the December wind, her face drawn with a pride that was crumbling at the edges like old mortar. Silas was ill. A lung fever had settled deep in his chest, a rattling, wet cough that would not break no matter how many poultices Ruth applied or how many prayers Reverend Pruitt offered. Their woodpile was nearly gone. The store had been shuttered for weeks because there was nothing left to sell. Ruth did not beg. She did not explain or justify or apologize. She simply stood in the cave mouth, her breath rising in clouds, her eyes meeting mine with a directness that I had never seen in her before. She had climbed this mountain alone, the same mountain I had climbed 3 years ago with a dying mother on a sled. She had made that climb in the cold and the wind and the deep snow, and the fact that she was standing here, her hands raw, her legs trembling, told me everything I needed to know about how much it had cost her to come. I looked at her for a long time. The fire was warm at my back. The axe was within reach. The wall I had built against Elias Cobb and against the cold and against every force that had tried to destroy us stood solid and sure between us. I could have turned her away and the justice of it would have been perfect. Silas Crawford had signed the paper that sent me and my mother into the cold to die. He had called us a burden. He had not even had the decency to look me in the eye when he did it. Here was his wife, come to ask for the mercy he had denied me, and I had every right, every moral justification, every reason in the world to say no. But I heard my mother's voice, clear as the mountain air, steady as the fire's draw. A shared crust is still a crust. A hoarded one turns to stone in your belly. I stepped aside. Come in, I said. I gave them the stone room beside the fire. I fed Silas broth made from dried venison and the herbs I had learned to gather from the mountain's deeper passages. I kept the fire burning through the long nights while his breathing rattled and hitched and caught, and slowly over the course of 2 agonizing weeks began to clear. Ruth sat beside him through all of it, her hand on his chest, her lips moving in silent prayers that may or may not have been heard by anyone but the stone. Silas Crawford did not apologize. Not once in the 2 weeks he lay by my fire in the home he had tried to take from me, eating food that my hands had grown and prepared, breathing air warmed by a hearth I had built from the rubble of the life he had destroyed. The words were not in him. Perhaps they did not exist in his vocabulary, or perhaps the shame was too large for any words to carry. I do not know. I have thought about it often in the years since, and I still do not know. But on the day he left, he paused at the narrow entrance passage. He stood before the defensive wall I had built, the waist-high barricade of stone and mortar that I had raised against Elias Cobb and against the world's assumption that a woman alone was a woman defeated. He put his hand on the stone, his palm flat against the cold, rough surface. He held it there for a long moment, his fingers spread, feeling the texture of the mortar and the weight of the granite and the invisible labor of the woman who had stacked each stone with bleeding hands in an unbreakable will. Then he looked at me. His eyes were wet, his mouth was a thin, trembling line, and he nodded, a single slow movement of his head. It carried in it everything he could not say, and everything he knew, and everything he wished he could undo, but could not. It was not enough. It would never be enough. No nod could undo what he had done. No gesture could rebuild the life he had torn down with 14 votes and a piece of paper. But I accepted it, not as forgiveness. Forgiveness is a word people use when they want the story to have a clean ending, and this story does not have a clean ending because life does not have clean endings. What I accepted was something more complicated and more honest. I accepted the closing of a circle, the acknowledgement, silent but unmistakable, that the world is more complicated than any charter, and that the measure of a person is not taken in a council room, but in the choices they make when the cold comes and the easy answers run out. I began to write in Josiah Crane's journal. I turned to the first blank page after his final entry, and I picked up my pencil and I added my own voice to his. I wrote about the garden, about which seeds thrived in the thin mountain soil and which rotted in the cold ground before they could germinate. I wrote about preserving food, about drying venison in thin strips over the fire, about pickling vegetables in jars sealed with beeswax. I wrote about the coal seam, how deep it went, how to extract it without weakening the passage walls. I wrote about the herbs that grew on the high slopes in summer, about which ones eased pain and which ones helped with breathing and which ones could bring down a fever if prepared correctly. I wrote about my mother, about her gruel and her candles and her 47 imaginary forks, about the way she could read a person's character in their footsteps, in a season's severity in the behavior of birds, about her hands which had been still for months now, but whose work was everywhere I looked. The journal was no longer the story of one man. It was a chain, a conversation across the years between people who had never met and never would meet, but who understood each other completely, because they had all stood in the same place at the edge of the same abyss, facing the same choice to fall or to build. Each of us had chosen to build, and each of us had left something behind for the person who would come next. I lived on that mountain for the rest of my days. I never remarried. Not because I did not miss the companionship or the warmth of another person beside me in the dark, but because I had found a purpose that filled those spaces with something equally sustaining. I was Clara Whitfield of the shelter, and that was enough. The mountain was my companion. The memory of my mother was my guide. The ghost of Josiah Crane was my colleague, and the steady stream of broken, desperate, cast-out, forgotten people who found their way up the mountain and through the cave mouth and into the warmth of my fire were my purpose, my family, my proof that the council had been wrong about everything. I grew old on that mountain, the way the mountain itself grew old slowly and with dignity, each year adding another layer to what was already there rather than taking anything away. My hair turned silver. My joints stiffened in the cold mornings. My eyes, once sharp enough to spot a deer at 300 yards, grew cloudy around the edges. But my hands never lost their strength. The hands my mother had held and called good hands remained good hands until the very end, capable of splitting wood and stacking stone and reaching out to pull a stranger in from the cold. Bess died in the second winter, peacefully lying beside the fire she had helped warm with her own body. I buried her near the cave mouth where the first spring flowers grew, and I missed her quiet company more than I would have thought possible. She had been the last living connection to the life James and I had built together, and when she was gone, that life existed only in my memory and in the doorpost of a cabin that belonged to someone else now. But memory, I have learned, is a more durable building material than wood. It does not rot, it does not burn, it only grows stronger with time, the way stone grows stronger under pressure. People ask me sometimes what the secret was. How did you survive? They would say, leaning forward with eager eyes, and behind their words was always the same unspoken hope, that the answer would be simple: a vein of gold, a hidden spring, a stroke of luck, a miracle. They wanted to believe that survival was a matter of fortune rather than labor, because fortune requires nothing of you except gratitude, and labor requires everything you have, and then ask for more. I would tell them this truth, and they would nod politely and look disappointed and go away still looking for the easy answer. The secret is the work itself. The secret is in refusing to accept the label someone else gives you. The secret is in looking at a cold, empty space and believing against all evidence and all reason and all the accumulated wisdom of men who have never built anything harder than an argument that you can make it warm. They called me a burden, and in doing so, they gave me the freedom to find my own strength. They sealed a door behind me and forced me to find a new one, a better one carved not from wood but from the living rock of a mountain no one believed in. And I opened that door not just for myself, but for my mother and for Josiah Crane and for Hank and Nettie Dawson and for the Walker family with their 3 starving children and for Silas Crawford and his wet rattling cough and for every person who has ever been told they are too old, too weak, too female, too broken, too much of a burden to be worth saving. The last entry I wrote in the journal was simple. I wrote it on a spring morning sitting at the cave mouth with the sun on my face and the green valley spread below me like a promise. Josiah Crane had ended his entries with the words, "You are not alone. I was here before you." And beneath those words, in the space he had left, as though he knew someone would need it, I wrote my own. He was here, and then I was here, and after me there will be someone else. This is not a dead end. This was never a dead end. This is where the road begins. Carry the fire, build the hearth, open the door, and when the next person stumbles in from the cold, do for them what the mountain did for me. Give them shelter, give them warmth, give them time. That is all any of us really needs. Time and a fire and the knowledge that we are not alone. The mountain still breathes. The fire still draws. The door is still open. All you have to do is walk through it. And when you do, you will find the journal on the ledge beside the hearth. You will find Josiah's words and my words and the words of everyone who came after us, a chain of voices reaching back through the years, each one saying the same thing in a different way. You are not the first to stand where you are standing. You are not the first to feel what you are feeling. You are not the first to believe that the cold is stronger than you are. But look around you. Look at the fire. Look at the walls. Look at the evidence of every hand that had touched this stone, every life that has been sheltered within it. The cold is strong, but we are stronger. We have always been stronger, not because we do not feel the cold, but because we build fires anyway. That is the secret. That is the only secret there ever was. Build the fire, open the door, and never ever let anyone tell you that you are a burden. You are the shelter you always were.